I'm Bambi Francisco for Vader TV, the network for innovators, and I'm speaking with Ramu Yalamanchi. He's the CEO and founder of Hi5, and we're going to talk about how consumers and people are changing their habits online, how they're changing the way they communicate and socialize online, specifically on Hi5. Ramu, thanks for joining me again.
Thank you.
So I noticed on Quantcast that Hi5 has 74% addicts, and that's great. It's actually higher than Facebook at 64%. So what are people doing on your site?
What are people doing on Hi5?
Why are they addicts?
Good question. So in terms of why people come to Hi5, the most fundamental reason that people are on the service is to stay connected with friends and to enhance a lot of what's happening in personal communications. So if you look at just over time, if you look back 50 or 100 years, and the number of ways that people had to stay connected and to personally communicate, it was like the letter, the phone.
The letter in the bottle?
Exactly, right.
Throw it out in the ocean.
You could ship it, right, exactly. There's a letter, the phone. I mean, and now more recently there's just a range of ways that people have to personally communicate. So I mean, email and SMS, and I think the way people are using Hi5 is to enhance personal communications with their friends. And so that comes in the form of, what were you doing last weekend? Well, people will, upload photos of the trip that they just took.
Yeah.
And that becomes, it's a different form of communication than what we've seen in the past. One of the things that we've noticed is in a place like Mexico, in the last year, in the 15 to 24 demographic, Hi5 grew about 81%. And if you look at different mail services like Yahoo Mail, Hotmail, and actually most of the mail services, they pretty much are flat or slightly declined. And what that indicates to us is that a service like Hi5 is actually replacing a lot of the personal communications that were happening in places like email. So staying connected, I mean, that happens in different forms, whether it's photos, whether it's status updates, whether it's changing a profile to kind of tell people what's happening.
Yeah, I think more people, I think there's been studies done too that show that people are communicating more on social networks than they are in email. They probably won't, and maybe even more on IM.
Yeah.
Definitely less than email. So what, I recently moved and I didn't have any photos. I realized that all my photos stopped in 2003. And I used to have tons of
regular print photos, right?
Print photos.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I don't know, maybe that's another change too, and people don't collect things anymore, they're collecting everything online.
Right.
I mean, what do you think the average person collects on their profile?
Yeah, I mean, so clearly any kind of digital media is a really big part, right? So whether it's photos or whether it's videos or whether it's them actually putting in text in the form of status updates and such. But I mean, one of the interesting things you mentioned was about the importance of photos. And I think this happens with every new wave of technology. So if you look around that time that you just mentioned, like, maybe between 2000 and 2003, digital cameras became much more widely used, right? And really started to take a dent into the regular cameras. And so, and I think if you look around, the 03, 04 time, that's also when social networks started to gain quite a bit of traction.
Right.
So I think maybe the next trend you'll start to see is with things like video. Right, so video today is still not quite as easy as it is to take a camera and a photo on a digital camera and upload it to your favorite social network. And as that becomes easier, I think you'll start to see videos also become, the way that people are communicating what they're doing and the importance of it.
What do you, when I talked to Max Levchin from Slide, and he said the biggest concern, for him, thing that he thinks about all the time is how do you keep people engaged on the site? What are you doing what are you monitoring, and what are you releasing to keep them engaged? Yeah,
so we first think about it from what are the principles and what are we trying to provide? And if we think about Hi5, fundamentally what we're trying to do is provide a social experience. We're trying to enhance the way people interact with their friends, and we want to make it fun. And those are the really three basic concepts. And so when we're thinking about building product, and when we're thinking about what features should we build more of, or just start to build, those are the dimensions that we look at, and those are the things that we measure. Are we actually helping to accomplish those three core goals?
Are those enough to keep a user? And what is it that, I guess what he said, what Max said, which I thought was an important point, you need to get them to mash things up, because if you left alone, your creation really isn't worth anything, and you could just leave it elsewhere and go to another social network or go somewhere else. So
I think the question of sustainability and like what will cause people to keep coming back and over a very long period of time, I think it comes down to mirroring what people do in their real lives. So we're all fundamentally, social beings. And so what social networks are doing is they're really providing an online adjunct to your real life. And so the more that we can do to fill that gap, then I think that the time just comes online. So as an example, right, before the way that you would get updates from your friends, you might meet them in a bar or a coffee shop, and you still do that today. But there's a whole stream of information coming online in the form of photos that may be from friends who you went to college with, or maybe with friends that you went to high school with. And so I think really looking at people's real world lives and saying like this is fundamentally important, and then providing a way online that they can do the same thing. It keeps the service sustainable. Around that are things like communication, right? So once you have that content, then there's a whole stream of communication that can happen as related to it, right? You went somewhere, on a trip, and oh wow, how was the trip, right? All the sorts of communications that kind of cause you to want to interact with your friends on the service.
What's been the most surprising characteristic, or sort of characteristic about people or human nature that you've observed?
I think people want to share a lot more than I would have expected, and I think as a service, we need to help people in figuring out what they should be sharing, what they shouldn't be sharing, and things like, given no constraints, I think people want to share a lot. And really, how do we help that? How do we enhance that? The other side that's been interesting is how fundamentally creative people really are, and giving them a set of tools and basically a canvas, how much they can do to express themselves, and so we've provided things like they can very easily change the background of their profile page. That's and we've created a whole way for them to do that easily for the novice user, but for expert users, they can go and actually create the backgrounds. And so by leveraging a community around the world, what we've seen is there's just this vast range of creativity, and secondly, there's this kind of appetite for people to kind of present themselves in different ways, and so like changing their background skins or.
I've always thought that they were sort of your dorm rooms, the profiles. What's the big difference between, say, you're pretty big in Spain? What's the big difference between the way they interact and the way? Do they take siestas? Are they off at 4? Off their social networks? And
it's interesting you mention that. So like around the Thai New Year, which was recent, so we're the #1 social network in Thailand, the #2 site there overall. We'll notice a dip in traffic and times like that.
Okay.
But there are definitely features that vary in terms of how they get used in different markets. So comments will be bigger in certain markets than in other ones.
Like where?
Thailand, I think, is a big market for comments. I mean, I think so the way that people choose to communicate and how that's become popularized in a given country, it seems to vary.
You think with everyone so connected, we'd all sort of assimilate, we'd be the same at some point, cultures would be somewhat.
I think the fundamental behavior is the same, but in terms of how people actually follow through on that and what specific feature ends up being popular in one market versus another tends to vary a little bit.
Okay, I have just one question. Do you authenticate the users, and do you police your site?
Do we authenticate
the users? You might have one user with multiple profiles, but that's fine.
So we don't look for things like that. What we do look at are basically behaviors and patterns, and that will cause certain systems to tell us to look at the user. We look at things like messaging activity, and those are the sorts of things that we do monitor.
What's your high-level philosophy on that privacy issue or the interaction between, sort of a 50-year-old guy pretending that he's a 21-year-old dating this other, 18-year-old who's actually a 14-year-old or something like that?
Right. I mean, it's a good question. So, I mean, our philosophy on it is that, so we want to make it easy for the set of people that are using High5 in the way that we intend them to. But at the same time, we want to provide a set of privacy controls so people can protect themselves from, not getting solicited by folks that they really would rather not. So in the case, I think that you mentioned, we do have some systems that will look at certain patterns and assess whether it's, something that we should actually have a person look at more closely.
Okay. Well, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Giving us your insight into the observations of how people communicate and socialize on High5. You certainly have a global view of
Thank
that.
you. Yeah,
Thanks, Ramu.
Yeah.
I've been speaking with Ramu Yalamanchi, and I'm Bambi Francisco.